A third region which served as a major source of slaves for Europe and Africa was the coast of Brazil. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, sailing to India, touched along the Brazilian coast. It appeared that at least one American was sent back to Portugal with Gaspar de Lemos. This initially friendly contact was not to last, however, since the King of Portugal seems to have envisioned the coast of Brazil as a second slave coast. He let a contract to Fernão de Noronha and a company of merchants to trade in Brazilwood and slaves. They were to send to Brazil 6 ships each year. 4 ships were sent in 1503 and they returned to Portugal full of wood and slaves. It is known that the trade was fairly regular after 1504. From the very beginning, then, Americans were acquired as a commodity and shipped to Europe, as well as perhaps to Africa. In 1511, the Portuguese ship Bertoa, with 2 Negroes and 1 non-Negro slave on board, carried some 35 American slaves from Brazil to Portugal. Another ship in the following year was described as having the deck loaded with young men and women. From then on there, a frequent report of Americans being taken to Portugal, some for showing to the king and some for more ordinary servitude, as Capistrano de Abreu noted. The Portuguese began quite early to try to find markets for Brazilians outside of the Portuguese Empire. In 1538, 3 Portuguese ships reached Borinquen with 45 Portuguese and 140 American slaves, and a few free Americans. So there was, they say they reached Puerto Rico, Borinquen. A Portuguese captain later proposed to ship Brazilian slaves to Haiti, and initially 6 or 7 were sent. So you see that all these, they say that they were bringing Africans, the Spanish and Portuguese were bringing Africans to the Caribbean, and from there to the English were taking them and bringing them to America. These were from other parts of America by the thousands, from South America, Central America, wherever they were grabbing them. In 1550, however, Charles V resolved not to allow the introduction of Brazilians as slaves. Some years later, a Portuguese ship reached the island of Margarita with 300 American male and female slaves. They were sold, but in 1556 the Spanish crown ordered the guilty to be punished for violating the law. On the other hand, in 1570 consideration was given to authorizing the importation into Spanish colonies of Brazilian slaves enslaved by other Americans. This category of slave, as well as Caribes, that is, alleged cannibals, could be imported. In any case, one can see that between 1530s and 1570s, the Portuguese were actively attempting to market American slaves far and wide. Okay, you hear that? So within Brazil, the enslavement of Americans proceeded very rapidly, primarily for the use in sugarcane and cotton industries. You hear that? Caribbean. Later on, the donatorios between 1535 and 1550 document this process, as in 1545 when Pedro de Goes wrote to the king that in the fields and sugar refineries of Sao Tome there were enough slaves. The population of St. Vincent in 1548 including 600 free persons and more than 3,000 American slaves in 1548, according to a letter of Luis de Goes. So San Vicente, so they tell us that these are Africans they're bringing there. There's 300 American slaves, 3,000, American slaves there already. To the south of Bahia, only American slaves were mentioned as forming the labor force in 1584, especially in the southern and northern parts of Brazil, Sao Paulo, San Vicente, and Maranhão. And in the interior, the enslavement of Americans continued to be a major source of labor for centuries. Between 1630 and 1650, for example, from 100,000 to 200,000 Americans from the Paraguay region were enslaved and sold in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and elsewhere. It says here, in any case, Chief Martin of the Kurimeo nation complained to the Spanish in 1576 that the Portuguese of southern Brazil were carrying their children off to other parts of Brazil and then to Portugal to be sold as slaves. A Jesuit witnessed in 1635 a slave raid using 15 sea-going ships and many large canoes designed reportedly to secure 12,000 slaves from the Kurimeo nation. 12,000 slaves. One must suppose that many were to be secured for sale outside of Brazil. We can, I think, be confident that the Americans soon appeared in the Portuguese colonies in Africa and in the Cabo Verde Islands. Cabo Verde Islands. The high death rates on Portuguese sailing vessels of the period would make necessary for replenishing of crews in Brazil, and a somewhat later date, the use of the Brazilian natives and mixed bloods in the African trade in various capacities. Some Americans were utilized as military auxiliaries to Portuguese soldiers as well. So they're talking about indigenous people when they say Americans, right? In 1641, auxiliaries were to be sent from Bahia and Rio de Janeiro to reinforce the troops in Angola. Alright, so you hear that they were sending American Indians from Baja and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to reinforce troops in Angola in Africa, alright? And in 1644, the king approved as project to send Enrique Diaz with non-white auxiliaries from Bahia to Angola. Diaz was needed instead of in Brazil to fight the Dutch, but in 1645 an expedition left Rio de Janeiro for Angola. Again in 1648 and 9, some 2,000 men were sent from Rio de Janeiro to Angola. Alright, American Indians being sent to fight wars in Angola. The Portuguese troops in Angola were accompanied in their campaigns by auxiliary native troops, and thus we can be confident that the Brazilian contingents included persons of American origins. After 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil, and we can be sure that many persons of American ancestry went there. All right. 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil. It was a colony of Brazil, not the other way around, people. In addition to the normal kinds of contact, Angola was used as a place for sending Americans and other persons who proved troublesome in Brazil. So they were sending rebels, rebel Indians in Ceará, for example. Mixed blood and American undesirables were periodically rounded up and shipped off to Angola. 1720s onwards, alright? 1720s, they're supposed to be coming from that side. No, after about 1740, the island of Fernão de Noronha was also used as a dumping ground for such people, alright? This island off the coast of Brazil. In the south of Brazil, Americans and other non-whites were deported to Angola for gold smuggling or for using a route passing through a region exposed to attack by free Americans forces in the 1720s. Quite early, Americans were used in the settlement of Fernão de Noronha Island. In 1602, a Portuguese man was residing on the island with 13 or 14 Negroes. In 1612, a French vessel found only a Portuguese with a few tapuyas of both sexes, so tapuyas are natives, of both sexes. The French removed the Americans to Maranhão. The Portuguese generally referred to Tupi-speaking Americans of coastal Brazil as Brasis or Brazilians, while the non-Tupi nations were often referred to collectively as Tapuyas. Many American slaves were resold from Portugal to other countries, and this trade continued for at least a century. So it says in 1592, for example, a widower of Lisbon sold Beatriz, age 12, originally from Pernambuco, Brazil, to the Canary Islands. Many Americans were sold as slaves in Spain, as revealed by the notarial records of Seville and Valencia. It is not possible to be certain as to the numbers involved, since not all the slaves seem to have been properly registered, and also baptismal records are relatively scant. Moreover, many slaves are classified only to their color.